I'll tell you this, the way it returns to me in the small hours when the vents hum and the fluorescents bleed the color out of everything. Because that's when I can almost hear the room again. The monitors, the breath caught in a young woman's throat, and my own voice trying to sound steadier than I felt. I'm Avery Quinn, charge nurse at St. Brigid's Medical Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I've worked nights long enough to think I know what the dark can hold. But this one cleaved my life into before and after, not because of the blood or the speed of it, but because what should have been the simplest fact, a father's name, unraveled into something I still don't know how to name. The ER was in that lull that tricks you into thinking you're safe. We'd cleared a STEMI to cath, sent an ankle fracture upstairs, tucked a drunk and belligerent in 4-point restraints under a sitter's tired gaze, and I was finishing a note because I'm the kind of nurse who has to close loops, who learned young in a pastor's house that unfinished things invite worry, and I like to pretend I don't believe in that anymore. The doors slid open with the hydraulic sigh I have heard 1,000 times, but the air that came in was cold, not the polite cool of a conditioned lobby, a river cold that made me look up before the wheelchair bumped the threshold. Security was flanking a young woman with a blanket around her shoulders, bare legs and white canvas sneakers poking from under the hem like something a child would wear to a summer carnival, except for the way she held her belly, both hands pressed as if she were holding a secret tight inside it. Her face was the first thing that struck me. Eyes without sleep, the kind of determined calm I've only ever seen in people about to do something that will break them open. Triage here, I said, standing and moving to the desk. Ma'am, can you tell me your name? Lena, she said, and then swallowed. I think I'm having my said. I don't know what I'm having. The triage tech hit the vitals. HR 118. BP 132 84ths, temp 98.1, sat 99% on room air, respirations fast and tight. She was 22, ID confirmed, no known allergies, no meds, no surgical history. Abdominal pain? I said, because the script is a life raft in the dark. Cramping, she said, wincing. Low. It comes and goes. Any bleeding? She shook her head. When was your last period? The question you ask like knocking on a door you've gone through 100 times. She looked at me like I'd asked her to name the color of air. I don't know. I don't keep track. I haven't been, but She stopped and gripped the arm of the chair as another pain passed over her like a wave I could not feel but could see crest in her jaw. The fetal heart monitor wasn't on her yet, because why would it be? But in my head, I heard its imagined gallop. A superstition. A habit of mind. We rolled her to bed 12, one of the rooms by the supply alcove where the light flickers every third night, and no one seems to fix it because it only misbehaves when it's quiet. I hit the overhead light, dimmed it because she flinched, and pulled the curtain with my left hand, while my right was already reaching for the IV start kit. I'm gonna put a line in your left hand, okay? We'll do some labs, maybe an ultrasound, see what's going on. I'm not pregnant, she said, with the certainty of someone protecting a wall. I can't be. Okay, I said, because okay buys you time and trust. We'll check everything. The attending on that night was Dr. Patel, steady hands, quick eyes, the kind of doctor who addresses you by your name and makes you a little better at yours. She swept in as I hung a liter of normal saline, ordered a CBC, CMP, quantitative HCG, type and screen, urinalysis. Pain scale? 7, Lena said through her teeth, then 8, as it caught again. I placed the fetal Doppler on the tray without thinking about why, and then placed it back, because I didn't want to make a promise the universe would choose to mock. The lab runner took the tubes. I set the timer in my head. Stat labs in our place are 9 minutes if you're lucky, 11 if the tube system is sulking, and I gloved up for a quick bedside ultrasound because sometimes the past is louder than policy. When I was 19, my sister bled out in a bathroom 3 states away with no one there to put a hand on her shoulder or call 911, and ever since then, I've had a thing about not waiting when a belly aches. Cool gel, I warned, and she flinched. The probe itself is small, not the elegant wand of a formal OB ultrasound, but enough to tell you whether there's a landscape you should back away from or run toward. The screen bloomed in grainy shades, bowel gas, a sweep of bladder, the soft architecture of a uterus, and then motion, rapid, indignant, like a bird beating its wings. I didn't want to breathe, because I knew the sound would fill the room if I turned the knob, and I didn't know what it would do to her to hear it if she was insisting on an empty field. "Is that?" Dr. Patel said softly from behind my shoulder, and I nodded before I could help it. We both heard it at the same time. The house lights flickered. The monitor in the next bed went from a steady 78 to a jagged nothing and back, and the overhead announcement system hiccuped as if someone pressed the button and changed their mind. I told myself it was coincidence and power draw. I told myself the UPS batteries had been due for replacement for months. I told myself 1,000 rational things because the gel was cold, and her skin was warm, and under my hand, a baby's heart beat faster than a bird. "I'm not pregnant," Lena said again, but softer, like she was asking me to lie to her. "We're going to take care of you," I said, which is both a promise and a hedge. The quantitative HCG came back at over 180,000, a number that sits like a sunrise on a page, and the urinalysis had ketones that said she hadn't kept food down. She looked smaller in the bed than someone who has held a secret for months should look. No prenatal care. No vitamins. No chart that would have told us a due date. I asked the next question because the manual of my life is the only true scripture I have left. "Lena, when did you last have sex?" She turned her head toward the curl of the curtain where the light wavered and said, "I haven't. I'm not lying. I swear to God." I want you to know what it costs to hear that from a girl with pain on her face, and to be the one who knows the hymen is a poor witness, and trauma can hide itself so well that even the person who survived it doesn't see its shadow until long after, and also to be the person whose father preached about immaculate things so often that the word is a bruise you carry under your uniform. I want you to know how carefully I said, "We believe you," because that can be the only door someone can walk through without cutting themselves further. Her belly tightened under my palm and then relaxed. "Contractions," I said to Dr. Patel, and we both nodded, staff converging with an almost military efficiency that never stops feeling miraculous to me. OB was paged, NICU on standby, warmer plugged in, neonatal crash cart within reach, baby hat on the tray, though I can't tell you why that felt like a spell against despair. I set up the fetal monitor, slid the toco under the band across her belly, found the heart rate, 162, then 158, a good variability. And I swear to you the sound of it filled the room like something alive beyond the obvious. Security crowded the doorway because word gets around fast, and I shooed them with my eyes because this wasn't a spectacle, and it wasn't their story to watch. The first cervical check put her at 6 centimeters, 90% effaced, station -1, and now the words we use marched in: precipitous, unknown GBS status, unknown gestational age, meconium risk, shoulder dystocia plan, hemorrhage cart within reach. We put in a second IV. I drew blood for a repeat type and screen because the first tube clotted, which happens. Which means nothing, except in the moment it felt like a warning, a little refusal. I've had nights where rational things wear masks that look like omens. OB arrived, a resident with sleep in her hair and a senior who smelled faintly of peppermint and coffee, and they spoke to Lena softly. "You're okay. You're doing this. We're here." The contraction tore through her and she bit down on an admission. "He'll be angry," she whispered, and then, "I didn't do anything." The senior OB met my eyes and I read what she was thinking, because it was sprinting through me too. A man, a secret, a danger that followed her into the hospital. "Do you feel safe at home?" I said, the script riding ahead of my fear. "I don't know," she said, and then her face changed, not with pain, but with something like recognition, as if the room had shifted its furniture when the lights flickered again and the warmer clicked, as if someone had kicked the plug. The power didn't drop this time. Instead, the hallway units chirped off in a cascade, like birds spooked one after another. And for 3 seconds, the only sound in bed 12 was the fetal heart's underwater gallop and the ventilator down the hall trying to tell us it too was alive. The pastor's daughter in me counts those moments as signs, even as the nurse in me stacked reasons like sandbags against them. We moved Lena to stirrups not because we needed theater, but because she needed leverage. And when she said she needed to push, the OB nodded like she was agreeing to a truce. This is the part where I could tell you about the low moan she made that changed shape into something older than our building, or the way the baby's head crowned in a perfect seal brown arc without meconium, the perineum stretching like two hands pressed from the inside, or the way the heart rate decelerated to 120 and then recovered like a swimmer breaking the surface. But what I cannot tell you without sounding like I am making a story is that the temperature in the room dropped enough to fog my face shield even though I wasn't wearing one. A reflexive sense memory from pandemic days that shouldn't have had a physical echo. The senior OB said, "Push," and the resident said, "Good, and I said, "You're safe." And the baby slid into the world in a flood that was less than I expected for a term infant, less than I've seen 100 times, almost reverent in its economy. He cried immediately, a small outraged sound that made Lena laugh and sob at the same time, and I handed him to the OB who wiped his face and placed him on Lena's chest, skin to skin, the warmer forgotten, the hat still folded like a question on the tray. "Hi," she said, disbelief and wonder braided in her voice. "Hi." NICU checked tone and color, counted 5 and 5 at 1 and 5 minutes, pinked him with a firm rub, and I watched the pulse oximeter find a rhythm on his miraculous wrist. I have caught dozens of babies in strange places. The ambulance bay, an elevator, a bathroom stall lined with paper towels because a woman didn't want to be seen. But I have never felt the room like that, aware of us as if we were being watched by something that had no use for eyes. "We'll need to do some labs," the senior OB said gently. "Standard. Blood type, antibody screen, the usual newborn workup." She didn't say paternity test. None of us did. But the words hung in the air like a draft. "I told you," Lena said, eyes on the baby, stroking his wet hair. "I told you I didn't." "You don't have to tell us anything right now," I said. "You did something extraordinary." The placenta delivered intact with a soft rush. I massaged her fundus, felt the uterus clamp down, a good firm globe under my palm. Estimated blood loss 200 milliliters. I charted it because that's how you push back against chaos. You write, and you measure, and you name. We moved through the practiced ballet. Perineal check, small first-degree laceration, a tidy repair, IV fluids, a dose of Pitocin, maternal vitals, baby's temperature. I glanced at the monitor and saw something that made my skin lift. For a fraction of a second, just as the resident tied off a suture, the fetal heart tracing, which should have been flat, printed a single blip as if there were still a heartbeat to capture from the air. It was a glitch, it had to be. If that had been the only oddity, I wouldn't be telling you this. After an hour, when the baby was nursing like he'd been doing it forever, and Lena's color had come back, the senior OB asked me to sit with her while she took a more careful history. Not because we are interrogators, but because trauma hides, and sometimes the body doesn't let the truth surface until it knows where it will land. "No one hurt me," Lena said, and I watched her mouth as she said it, the set of her jaw, the way her eyes didn't flinch from mine. "I promise. Sometimes people don't remember," I said, as gently as I could. "Sometimes remembering feels like more danger." "No," she said. "I would know. Do you have anyone we can call?" Dr. Patel asked from the doorway. Voice soft. "My mother," she said. And then she said a pastor's name I knew, because my father had said it at our dinner table when I was 12, said it with admiration and a little too much certainty. "He'll come," she added, and something in me tightened. They came. Her mother with a sweater over a nightgown and slippers like clouds, and the pastor with his Bible like a badge and a look that found everything wrong with a room before it looked for a person. He touched the baby's head like he was checking for heat. "We give thanks," he said, and then turned to Lena. "You give thanks for your blessing." She smiled and shrank at the same time. He asked no questions and offered no names. The baby slept. The monitors went from frantic to bored, and the ER remembered itself. The ventilator down the hall settled its complaint. The drunken restraint snored. The flashing light by the ambulance bay door blinked twice and died. It should have ended there. A good story in a bad place. But the labs trickled back, like messages shoved under a door by someone who was torn between confession and performance. The baby was O-negative. Lena was O-negative. That alone meant nothing in the way everyone thinks blood means everything. But when the OB sent cord blood for paternity testing, because that's what families ask for later, and we try to be ready, The tech from the lab called up to say a thing I'd never heard in a voice that sounded like she wished she'd never learned to speak. "We're running this twice," she said, "because it looks like there are no paternal alleles." "Maternal contamination?" the OB asked, already pragmatic, already tamping the weird back into its box. "We'll rerun," the tech said, "but the pattern is odd. I tell you this, knowing that lab results are not stories, that sometimes DNA is a sleepy magician that repeats old tricks to distract you while it hides its missing rabbit, that chimerism and mosaicism and sample error are boring explanations that save lives because they keep people like me from climbing a staircase that isn't there. I tell you this also knowing that 30 minutes later the lab called again and said, "We'll be sending this out," and the OB said, "Good," and we all pretended not to hear the part of the sentence she didn't say, to someone who isn't going to call it contamination just because it doesn't make sense. The world didn't come banging on our doors that night. That came later, after someone in an office somewhere mentioned the words parthenogenetic pattern in a meeting, and someone else who once watched a documentary wrote an email they shouldn't have, and a reporter heard the outline of a story and colored the rest in with fear and ink. What the world got were headlines and phrases that sell: virgin birth, miracle baby, medical mystery, hoax, cult, lawsuit. What I got was the weight of Lena's head in the crook of my elbow when she cried, because her pastor said to bring the baby to the church so they could dedicate him, and she didn't want him on that stage, under those lights with strangers, hands on his hair, while they drew lines between her God and her body. What I got was the look on Dr. Patel's face when the senior admin told her not to talk to the press, and then told her not to talk to anyone, as if silence was a sterile field they could keep unbroken if they stapled our mouths shut. What I got was my father's voice on my voicemail saying he'd heard a rumor, and could we talk about the Lord's mysteries, and I deleted it because I was not ready to be 12, with a clean dress and a dirty secret again. People sent letters, some were kind, and some were shaped like threats with scripture wrapped around them. People left messages that sounded like proposals for a custody arrangement between heaven and earth. A man stood in the lobby one afternoon, holding a sign with a picture of an angel, as if angels can be coerced into appearing by Kinko's ink. None of that is the part one cannot forget. The part one cannot forget is the third night, when Lena was on postpartum, and the nurses down there called me because she asked for me by name. I went because you don't turn your back on someone who learned your face during pain, and also because I needed to see the baby again. To prove he was only and exactly a baby, which is to say a thunderbolt with a soft skull. He was asleep in the bassinet, one fist near his face as if he had been born arguing with the air. "Can you hold him?" she asked. And I said of course, and then was surprised by how afraid I was when I lifted him. He was warm and heavy, and a little milk-drunk, his breath a metronome against my chest. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with absolute lack of guile because that's what newborns do. They accuse you without language of the crime of being older than them. The lights in her room held steady. The monitors murmured. A woman down the hall laughed and then cried. A husband whispered, "You did it." And I believed in ordinary things again. "I dreamed," Lena said very quietly, the way people tell the truth only when they think it might not count. "Before this, months ago, I dreamed there was a man at the bottom of the stairs, and he said my name without moving his mouth, and I was scared until I wasn't, and then I woke up with a hand on my stomach and there was no one there." "Dreams are strange," I said, because what else could I say that wouldn't make me complicit in a story I couldn't support with orders and labs? "I know," she said. But I woke up and I knew I was not alone. She looked at me as if I could bless or cauterize that knowing. I thought of all the explanations I've learned to build. Sleep paralysis, incubus myths, riding into a century that has no use for them except as clickbait. A fugue state that stitched itself to a night a boy came over, and she forgot to remember later. I thought of parthenogenesis, and the weight of the words we throw like ropes across the abyss, in hopes of not falling in. I thought of my father reading from Luke, and how his voice always trembled a little when he reached the parts that sound like magic. "Do you think he's good?" she whispered, glancing at the baby. And my chest hurt, because what she meant was not about the baby, who was good in the only way babies are, which is to say, selfish and holy and full of their own screaming smallness. She meant what came before him. The shadow at the bottom of the stairs, the air that knew her name. "I think you are," I said, and I was careful not to answer a question I didn't know how to understand. "We discharge patients. We do not discharge mysteries." Lena went home with a car seat voucher and a list of follow-ups and a community health nurse scheduled to come by. The pastor took the newborn car seat in his hands, like it might bite him, and then smiled a smile men use when they think they have already won something you didn't know you were fighting over. Dr. Patel wrote a summary note that was a masterpiece of caution and clarity, the kind of document that would stand up in court or in a late-night audit with the same steel-backed grace. I went home and slept and dreamed nothing I could keep. Weeks later, a journal published a letter about a case of haploid-like homozygosity in cord blood, a phrase that means almost nothing unless someone tells you what to be afraid of. There were follow-up letters. There were rebuttals. There were podcasts. There were men with microphones who had never held a screaming newborn in the crook of an elbow and never had to tell a girl she was safe when she wasn't. There were also quiet days where nothing happened, except I put in lines and drew blood and kept people's heads above their own dark, and those days felt like a kind of worship I can still perform. I have tried to make sense of it with medicine, lab error, maternal contamination, chimerism, a story constructed by fear and embroidered by the press until the stitchwork covered the cloth. I have tried to make sense of it with memory, a girl who needed a world without blame and made one, and I stood inside it with her for a time and believed, because belief is a form of care too. I have tried to make sense of it with the ghost of my father's voice, telling me that not everything of God looks like order from the vantage point of a chart. None of it holds the whole. Sometimes, coming out of room 12 on an ordinary night when someone's gallbladder stopped being a friend and someone's blood sugar reminded them that rules have teeth, I think I smell the air the way it was when the doors opened and Lena came in. The river cold? The brackish promise. And I tell myself I'm remembering the HVAC. Sometimes, when I run my hand under a faucet to warm the gel, and it is already warm, I think of the way the baby's skin felt, a heat-like proof. Sometimes, when a pastor's number lights up my phone and I don't answer, I catch my reflection in the black screen and see a girl who thought she could keep the world from breaking by labeling it correctly, and I want to tell her that names are not fences. People ask me, in whispers that respect the part of me that can't be sterilized, what I think happened. I say I think a young woman brought a life into the world, and the world did what it always does. Tried to lay claim to it, to assign it to one side of a ledger, light or dark, miracle or fraud. I say I think hospitals are thresholds, and thresholds are where stories get ambitious. I say I think medicine is a language with many dialects, and sometimes you hear a sentence that sounds like a prayer because you don't know the word for it yet. And I say that in a room with a flickering light and a warmer that wouldn't hold temperature for 3 minutes, and a fetal monitor strip that recorded the heartbeat of something that wasn't there anymore. I felt the presence of good and the suggestion of its opposite, and I held a baby who was only exactly himself, and also, if you listen to the world, the rope in a tug of war between meanings. I am an ER nurse. My job is not revelation, it is witness. It is hands and tape and saline and words said in the right order when the right order is the only thing we have. But nights still come when I feel the weight of him in the cradle of my arms. The way his breath raised and lowered the little blue blanket. The way Lena said hi like she was apologizing and celebrating at the same time. And I think about fathers. The ones who stay, the ones who leave. The ones who are ideas dressed in bones. The ones who arrive at the bottom of the stairs and call your name without moving their mouths. On those nights, I am not a pastor's daughter, or a skeptic, or a scientist. I am someone who lights the warmer and listens for a heartbeat and tells a girl she is not alone. And when the vents hum, and the fluorescents wash the room pale, and the strip on the machine curls onto the floor like an old photograph letting go, I hear myself say a thing I did not know I believed, until I tried to sleep without it. The case will always feel like standing in a doorway with my hands open, knowing something stepped through me and left the room changed, and that I will be measuring the temperature of that air for the rest of my life.